But Bob, the New Testament is full of warnings about what happens if you live a life of sin. What if someone commits a serious sin like murder or child abuse or adultery? Won't they lose their salvation?
Well, obviously the Bible warns us repeatedly against falling away, and the Bible warns us repeatedly of walking away from the Lord both morally and doctrinally. But the consequence is not loss of everlasting life. The consequence is judgment now and judgment at the judgment seat of Christ. So the real issue in terms of moral failure, like murder or child abuse or whatever, is that that person is dishonoring God and they're going to reap the consequences. Paul says, whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. Right? God is not mocked. So what we sow, we reap, in this life and in the life to come. Although believers have everlasting life, the fullness of that life in the life to come depends on how we live now. I graduated from Dallas Seminary, and one of the sad jokes we used to hear was that we could have an alumni association in Huntsville, Texas, and Huntsville is where the state prisons, the major state prisons are. And there are lots of guys in Huntsville who are there for a variety of horrible crimes. They're there for one of the pastors in the Metroplex, who was a Dallas Seminary graduate, was sent there because he was abusing boys in his church, and it came out, and he pleaded guilty and got 40 years to life, minimum of 40-year term for that. There was a man who was pastor of one of the Fellowship Bible churches. Gene Getz had discipled him, and he was sent to Huntsville for a major crime. There have been all kinds of people who do this. And sure, there are people who say, oh, well, that must mean they weren't really born again, or that must mean they lost everlasting life. No, that must mean that there are a lot of broken vessels out there. That must mean there are a lot of hurting people, including pastors, including seminary professors, including theologians. And we see this all the time. And we shouldn't conclude, whoa, that means they're not born again. What we can conclude is they failed. Didn't David fail? I mean, he commits adultery and murder, and yet he's a man after God's own heart. What do we do with that? And don't we have all kinds of examples? Peter denies Jesus 3 times, and yet, you know, he's one of the greats in the history of the faith, along with King David. And there's just example. I mean, Solomon, for example, in 1 Kings 11, he ends up an idolater at the end of his life. Here's an author of Scripture, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and Song of Solomon. This man, obviously a regenerate man, and yet he ends up as an idolater. And so there's no guarantee that if we're born again, we're not going to have some major moral failure.